EU will ask it to do. Right? So it's a little bit like neoclassical economics, right? You ask someone to repair your shoes, and you will pay them because you assume that they don't necessarily have, you know, a very sort of strong intrinsic motivation to repair your shoes. They will do it because you pay them, and that's fine. What they call their theory or their model explains this sort of outcomes well, right? When there will be reforms and when there will not be reforms. But if the domestic government does have intrinsic motivations to Europeanize or to democratize in our case, or to liberalize its economy if you deal with political economy, right? Then we find that the external incentives model does not do a very good job. We think that if there are intrinsic motivations, then if the European Union offers sizable, specific, and credible incentives, then there will be a reinforcement of reforms. And if it does not offer, or if it stops offering credible, sizable, and specific incentives, then there's going to be a decline in reforms. Not just a plateauing, but a decline, right? And to give it a theoretical sort of underpinning, we have referred to what is known in psychology as motivation crowding theory. And some political economists like Philippe Aguillon and Jean Tirole, so mathematical economists, have developed models to give a rational choice or a game theoretical interpretation of that phenomenon. And that phenomenon is basically what I was just saying, is that if you give external incentives to someone to do something that the person already wants to do, they will do it more in the short run. But once you take away your external incentives, they will be left with no intrinsic motivation to do it. And they will basically be hating to do that task. And psychologists have measured this with children, with adults. Economists have measured it with waste management, experiments on waste management referendums in Switzerland. And everyone finds that it's you know, there is some truth in it, right? So basically we're asking ourselves, might it not be the case that some countries that the European Union wants to incentivize to do certain things actually want to do them? And once the incentives become less strong or less credible, then they are left with that hollowing out of their intrinsic motivation has disappeared. So we talked to Schimmelpfennig about this, and he said that no, that it's very difficult to prove our point. At the very best, there would be some sort of observational equivalence with their cases. But basically, he says that all these Central and Eastern European countries that wanted to democratize in the 1990s wanted that because they wanted to enter the European Union. Which, you know, that's his interpretation. We don't necessarily agree with that. So we think that.
Can I just ask one quick question, clarification question? I mean, we can talk about this later. But intrinsic motivation, you treat it as an exogenous factor. I mean, where does it come from? What is the term? How is it determined?
So we define it as electoral gains to be made from, in our case, democratization. That it does not have anything to do with what the European Union will do to the country in terms of benefits, money, membership, political influence, whatever. It has to do with the electoral gains of some candidates in domestic elections that then becomes okay. So good question. That's yeah, that's very key actually. So basically we then focus on Turkey, and we first document beyond any doubt the original intrinsic motivation of the AKP, the mildly Islamist party that has been in power for 20 years now, to democratize. So we show that even in the 1990s and certainly at the beginning of the 2000s, they had a very strong own incentive, not related to the EU, to democratize the Turkish polity. And the reason for that is exactly why we don't have the paper yet, because the person who is helping me now is translating from Turkish. But it has to do with the fact that Turkey was basically a sort of softly military regime, right? So it's the Kemalist tradition, which was republican but not democratic. Basically, in order to protect the Turkish democracy, the Turkish Republic, they had to limit the democratic rights of many segments and groups in social groups, right? So AKP came to power promising more democracy. And even if you look at the way they were created in the mid-1990s, the fact that they wanted to democratize Turkish society was very central in their concerns, not because of Europe. So that's why we need a lot of translation from their foundational debates and stuff like that, right? But the main thing they were hoping for from democracy was electoral gains, was to basically allow people who didn't vote because they felt Muslim to vote for them, right? Same with a Muslim scarf for women that was banned, right? They wanted these things. They want a sort of liberalization of Turkish laws, or democratization of Turkish laws, if you want, or greater civil liberties, and all, for their own reasons, which were ideological and also electoral. We then showed that backsliding was not due to any of the classic explanations, right? There was amazing rates of growth, steadily declining inequality, declining Kurdish threats. There were, of course, other threats, but, like the Gülenist movement and the attempted coup d'etat and all this, but these came a lot later, a lot after the decline in Turkish democratic quality had already started. And therefore, what we're in the business of showing now is that the EU's strong insistence on the AKP democratizing Turkish polity basically hollowed out their own intrinsic motive. They lost ownership. And they started talking from 2002 onwards about democratization as a European Union related issue, and not the way they had talked about it in the late 1990s, right? So the way we interpret this is that they lost ownership of the issue. And once they had lost ownership of the issue, when it became apparent that the European Union was not going to accept them very easily into the club, they just turned against it. And this is why you observe first a decline in civil rights from 2003 onwards, and then from the end of 2004 onwards, a decline in judicial independence, and so on and so forth, until all things that you have probably are more recent in our memories and we know a little bit better. And then one last thing, and then I'll let you, well, I will ask you for your ideas, comments, or criticism. Then what we try doing, because we are aware that obviously, you know, our demonstration is so verges on the interpretative, and we want something a little bit stronger than that. We also compared to Hungary. And we're trying to find also some other country, perhaps from the EU's periphery, which has undergone a slightly different trajectory. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yanis. That was very domestic presentation. Just looking at you without a PowerPoint, and just with rules structure as well. But in theory, I'm the reviewer. Well, I don't know, many ideas come to my mind, okay, to just listening to you. The first one would be is that I have a perception that you are at the end of the day, what you're doing is democratization. You are taking the Turkish case and you are including issues related to the urban integration and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, you are testing to some extent democratization is taking place or has taken place, or why not in the case of Turkey. Okay, and I think this is a fascinating issue, particularly if you mix it with European issues. Okay. Because I don't think there are many cases in the literature that actually have studied this. So from that perspective, I think this is it's a rather innovative way of thinking from democratization theory. However, even if it's at the end of the day democratization, I didn't see that you are actually using some theories of democratization. And actually, your point of departure is pretty much a top-down perspective. I mean, and the question here is, it is really possible to democratize, in this case, Turkish, as you say, polity from a top-down perspective, or only from a top-down perspective? And probably the answer, at least my view, is that it is not, okay? Because, I mean, all we know from democratization theories is that we need top-down, but also bottom-up approaches. And also these kind of mechanisms which are taking place at different levels. Okay, we have macro, but also meso, which are more institutional factors, and also micro, okay, which is basically public opinion and social values. And I think democratization theory has already tested quite well that the most important theory to explain democratization anywhere is the GDP per capita. Once you reach a particular amount, at least until now, because now we could say, we could argue, for example, China is growing quite a lot, but China is, well, I think it's a different case. But we are talking about, I mean, Turkey would be more related to the Western world than to the Eastern world, although I'm not so sure because I'm not an expert in Turkey, okay? But I have the perception that I've been only once in Turkey. I have the perception that there is a clear Western society there. At least part of the society is pretty much looking at Europe. Okay. So yeah. So I think it's very interesting to test these theories about the crowding out effect, and also about the. You didn't say that it's not a theory, but you could say that the positive or the external incentives model, well, I think it's very interesting. It's actually what we are doing in our book. In our book, we are seeing, and the previous papers, and also later with Joan, we are going to see to what extent these conditional factors are important for changing the working in different countries, okay? And one of the main conclusions of our book actually is that these factors are irrelevant. I mean, well, they're not irrelevant, but I mean, because of course, I mean, if you have this top-down process, you are able to change things, okay, through, for example, normative processes. And but at the end of the day, I mean, to sustain this process across time, you need, this is based on cultural values, and public opinion, and at the end of the day, that you change this change is actually taking place as far as this is transferred into this micro level. Okay, otherwise all these structures are extremely well, I would say they're not consolidated. They could change from one day to another day, and they're not very consistent. Okay. So, and I think this is maybe, I don't know, I'm not a Turkish expert, but maybe this is something like this is happening to Turkey. I think it's a fascinating case because you didn't mention in your presentation, but I think in your PowerPoint presentation, you just mentioned also that Turkey has been increasing their GDP gradually, but still this process, there has been a kind of backsliding in the democracy. Okay, so this is very interesting case actually, because this is pretty much going against what democratization theory is saying. And maybe, I don't know whether there are geostrategical factors or other international factors, because clearly the autocracies in around the world, they are providing probably the right message that, I mean, economic development is possible without democracy. Okay, I mean, China is clearly sending this message, And maybe Mr. Erdogan, he likes this message. Okay, maybe he can be happy just bringing wealthy to Turkish people, but just becoming a real autocrat. Okay, so and clearly with a very poor standards of democracy, okay, across the country. So I don't know if this helps, but this is just my general thinking about everything you were saying. To be honest, I don't think you will be able to explain to find causality explanation on this, because there are many causal factors, and to disentangle different factors, you need to find data, which is extremely hard to find. But you don't need to find a causality. I think we can learn a lot about the Turkish case, because clearly it's a paradigmatic case in Europe. Also, the Hungarian case is very interesting, I think. So from another perspective, but clearly is also very interesting. So I think, and not only the Hungarian case, I would say also some Eastern European cases, okay, in which to some extent there are some common grounds, because while, for example, the Slovaks only vote 18% for the European Parliament election, they don't have this kind of a democratic culture, okay? And this means, and this, I think this is a general problem of most of, I'm not so sure whether all, but most of the Eastern European countries, that this is a slow process. And in the meantime, clearly, I mean, even if a democracy is trying to be developed through the top-down process, at least from the European Union, clearly this does not work, or it does not work properly. Okay, so yeah, I mean, I would tell you to be more ambitious and to include in your analysis of this paper also their countries, because clearly there are similar processes which are taking place, and that could actually provide you more variation and more capacity to explain something that are actually happening in Turkey. Okay, so this is all I can say, and now I will just ask Alexandra, and maybe then Joan wanted to say something as well. Alexandra?
Yeah, okay, thank you so much. And thanks so much, Yanis, for this very interesting and thought-provoking piece of research or research puzzle. So I have some comments that Javier has already made. I think here it is essential to consider also issues such as public opinion, values. I mean, these processes do not happen in a vacuum, right? And you already mentioned that, responding to my earlier question, that intrinsic motivation comes from perceived possible electoral gains. So where and how do these gains change, right? When and why democracy ceases to be a motivation for people to vote for a certain party, and they start not caring about it. No? I think there is so I am intimately familiar with the case of Poland, which I think you could also perfectly include in your study as a comparative case. And I think that for sure there has been some kind of transformation that has to do with a disillusionment with the costs of democratic transformation, etc., on the side of the citizens, right? That you have to keep in mind and take into account. So, because without that, you're not able to explain how a country that was so committed to the idea to transformation to democracy then starts voting in this populist, almost authoritarian leaders, and they don't care at all, or seem not to care so much about the deconstruction of the democratic system, as long as some improvements in welfare, for instance, are implemented. So I think, but I think it would be very interesting to have this kind of comparative study. And I think this question about, so I agree with Javier that maybe it's not so much about the conditionality of the EU, which could be an additional factor, but more about how these motivations change, right, and why. And maybe the conditionality could be another factor, but I mean, I don't think there is a causality that goes from EU conditionality. So I don't really buy this argument about the crowding out, right? Because the as you call it, the intrinsic motivation is very much rooted in not only among the elites but also in the society, right? So what happens that this changes? I don't think this has to do with the conditionality of the EU, honestly. Yeah, so I think this is like my main, I think, reaction to this paper. But I think it would be great to try to see it comparatively and try to maybe include more factors such as I don't know, support for democratic principles in public opinion, for instance, or I don't know, some value orientation or some kind of measure of commitment to democracy of governing parties or something. I mean, I think there, as Javier says, there are so many factors, but I think so. Of course, we cannot model the whole process, but I think it's important to at least count with the bottom-up part, right? The society, kind of how it conditions the changing strategy of the government. Yeah, but thanks so much. It was very interesting.
Thank you. Many thanks, Alexandra. Now, Jan.
Yes, thanks for the presentation, Yanis. No, I also wanted to put another element that might be useful on the table, and I'm not an expert on this literature on democratic backsliding at all, but one concept that has that I think is interesting from this literature is this idea of illiberal democracy that in Hungary and also in Poland has been used sometimes, either to analyze or by the political actors themselves, and it refers to this notion that democracy is the combination of the will of the majority plus the rule of law, democracy plus liberalism, and so on. And I don't know if this, I mean, my knowledge on Turkish politics is completely superficial, but from this, I was thinking that a possibility also could be that the AKP, the Erdogan's party, was mainly concerned with the democratization of the Turkish state in the sense of not necessarily liberal democracy, but democracy in the sense of will of the people, in the sense of constraining the power of the Turkish military, in the sense of incorporating previously alienated sectors of Turkish society that did not participate in the political process, incorporating the sectors, I guess, low-income Muslim population, layers of society and so on, into the political process. And instead, it was less interested in democratization in the sense of building a rule of law, respect for individual rights, and so on. And this.
Thank you, Jan. I don't know. We still have a few minutes, so we'll have last intervention, and then Yanis, you can answer if you want. You can say something if you want. Gisela?
Just a very quick intervention, but I wouldn't completely discard the idea of taking into account European Union conditionality for accession, because I find it very interesting. And I'm not very sure, and of course, probably the internal factors and all the theory of democratization and the internal factors relating with public opinion and so on definitely play a role, but I wouldn't dismiss the idea of studying how this European Union external conditionality for accession has failed into transforming some member states, some countries, while it succeeded in transforming others. So, for my personal point of view, I would find it maybe even more interesting to make a comparison between the Turkish case of accession of candidacy to the European Union with another case in which the member state had, well, probably it's difficult to find, but some similarities, and one case achieved to get accession while the other, and achieve into this process of democratization, while the other, in this case Turkey, failed, and try to see whether European Union conditionality had maybe play a role in this sense. Maybe, I don't know if it could make sense, but also you could think about making a comparison with the Balkans. I don't know whether this could be another way of making it comparable, but I wouldn't completely discard this idea of European Union conditionality, because I personally find it very, very interesting.
So if I can just add very quickly, I think this is a great point. that I haven't thought about, and of course, it's also about the disillusionment with the process of accession, right? That in the cases of Poland and Hungary has not happened because their desire to become members has been fulfilled. So maybe then the process is quite different, right? One is related to some kind of disillusionment or frustration with the fact that it's not going anywhere. Then we have tried, we have, we don't see the benefits of that, so we change and see other strategy. But then, it's not such a good idea as I thought initially to compare with a country that has actually entered the European Union. So I think Gisela, you very nice point.
Thank you, Gisela and Alexandra. Yanis, now it's your turn.
Thank you very much. Thanks to everyone for listening to me and for all your great comments. I'll just answer very, very quickly to two things that I think were recurring in your comments. One is the more social perspective, because obviously you cannot implement democracy in a lasting way without this infiltrating into people's mentalities, right? It cannot, no country can keep being democratic if it's a purely top-down process. This, I think we totally agree. And actually we're in the process of finding data on the median vote, so on public opinion, and see whether we can make the argument for the median voter but the problem is that we only have the oldest data we have about support for democracy is from 2008, and we see that there was less support for from democracy than what the Commission was saying back in the 90s, although we don't have the figures for the 90s. So the only trustable sort of datum we have is from 2008. But we'll keep searching for it. We're doing searches in Turkish newspapers right now to try to see exactly, or whether we can infer some evolution of the median voter regarding affection for democracy. But this is a very, I mean, I totally agree with you. It's the paper would be a lot more, or the story, if you want, would be a lot more complete if we had data on public opinion. And the other thing that many of you, or two or three of you, commented on is more comparisons, and I also agree very much with this. I also remember, and when Duigo asked me to write this paper and I contribute to the theoretical part of it, and she does all the empirical. I immediately recalled Jacques Delors, so the former president of the European Commission, when I asked him back in 1993, I asked him, when do you think Turkey will join the European Union? And he laughed and said, 2 years after Morocco. So obviously, I always think about the comparison with Poland, because it would be economically stronger countries and they are similar in other respects, but also the one with Morocco as a country that has not been incentivized by the European Union, to see what happens in a country which has also had a supposedly pro-democratic government at some point, and that was not incentivized by the European Union. Perhaps it fared better in democratic terms than Turkey did. So that would also be an interesting comparison. But definitely, it's definitely the case that Poland, Hungary, Tunisia, and Morocco are in our radars. So we'll try to find the most rational sort of design there and go for it. But thank you very much.
For the public opinion data, Turkey has been participating in the World Values Survey since the 90s, for instance. So I'm sure we could find there maybe some kind of way to measure. I don't know if they have the item on support for democracy, but I mean, they have a lot of questions about values.
Okay.
Thank you. Juan, very, very shortly, please.
So Janice, so the thing is like, because you only assume agency from the point of view of domestic actors. This is what I got from the presentation, also from the slides. So why not agency from the EU level? Because of course, and I guess that if you go to this idea of historical institution, sociological institutionalism, this is now the new change. The structural fractures can be also mediated by agency in general. So, and this is what Schemenfelin, I think, also have in mind, is like, it's very difficult to prove because you really have to go to the mechanisms and see, and process tracing is perfect, but then this dialogue between elites could be very interesting. So why not adding agency to your puzzle from external pressures? Of course, it's not the same award, like in Ukraine right now, there's potential pressure, but what about adding agency? So the Commission has an incentive as well of using the current negotiation and developing democratization. So just as a suggestion.
No, that's a very good point. I mean, why is this outcome an equilibrium if the Commission is shooting itself on the foot by insisting on democratic reforms, right? So the answer is because they are constrained by their own legal rules, Copenhagen criteria, and whatnot, right? So they are more recently with the Western Balkans, they are trying to be a little bit more proactive and calculative. But back at the beginning of the 2000s with Turkey, they were not. It was blanket conditions. So yeah, but very good. That's a very but it's a very good point. We probably need to insist on this a little bit more. So on why we obtained that equilibrium result. Yeah.
But as you know, Yanis, there are so many equilibrium results that it is always extremely hard unless you really have. No, it's true. There could be hundreds of equilibrium results. So this is why everything's so complex, you know.
Of course. No. We're not claiming that we're not even imagining we can totally explain democratic backsliding in Turkey. We're just trying to be totally honest, we're just trying to argue that we have a better argument than the Schimmelpfennig and Sedlmeier, who basically say that Turkey did not have any intrinsic motivation to democratize. And then came the European Union, and so they did. And then the European Union left, and that's why they don't have. And everything they did was only to try to enter the European Union. We think this is a little bit ignorant about the motivations of the AKP at the beginning, and also about the exact process through which the European Union may impact on member states. But yeah.
Yeah, and also just to finish, because I only been once in Turkey, in Istanbul, but I remember I was pretty much in this European area, and I was feeling that I was in Germany, to be honest, in this area. And I had the perception that if you go within the Istanbul, if you go to one area or another area, you have the perception you are a completely non-democratic country and in the core of democracy. Okay, so there is actually huge variation within Turkish society. I mean, Turkish society is completely plural on the, at least, well, I'm talking about Istanbul. I'm sure that Istanbul is probably not representative of the whole country, okay? But I remember because some people told us, because I was there actually with some Turkish people, that the EU was responsible for the getting down of the democracy, because they were actually blaming the EU for the little support to make it stronger the democracy. I mean, I'm talking about this pro-European minority, a pro-democratization minority. Okay, so they were really upset about how the EU was actually working regarding to. But anyway, I mean, this is just a comment that doesn't add anything. But just to say that, I mean, these micro factors clearly are extremely complex also, because there is so much variation. Even if you take public opinion, I think you should really be very, very fine-grained in order to find this variation also within Turkish society. Okay. Anyway. Okay, so thank you, Yanis, for this great presentation. And then we move, we are on time, so this is good. Also to the next paper, which is by Gisela Hernandez and Carlos Tosa. Carlos Tosa is not here, so but Gisela is here. So the floor is yours, Gisela.
Okay, so I will share my screen. Yes, 1 second. Okay, can you see it? Okay. So thank you very much. As I introduced myself before, my name is Gisela Hernandez and I'm doing my PhD thesis with Carlos Closa. This is a paper in which we both are working on, and sadly he cannot be here today due to an agenda problem. So I will try my best to present to you what we are working on. Here you have a brief overview of the points I'm going to touch today. But in order to start, as a way of a very brief introduction, we all are very well aware that the European Union is living a very serious rule of law crisis, and that the European Union institutions are failing to properly use the enforcement mechanisms that they have at their disposal. Particularly stand out the case of Article 7, which has been completely paralyzed in the Council for almost 5 years, even though the Commission activated part 1 of the treaty in December 2017 and the Parliament did so in September 2018. And the Council has failed to vote and to decide whether to direct recommendations to these 2 member states due to the determining that there exists a risk of a breach of fundamental values. Research regarding the failure of Article 7 has concentrated on the weaknesses on the procedure and how the excessive agenda of the Council in making the rules of the procedure has watered down its effectiveness, but the literature has failed to pay the required attention to the role that national governments' preferences play in this watered down of the Article 7 procedure. There has been some attempts to do some classifications or to map out a national member states position, but these classifications present 2 weaknesses. The first one is that they take as the units of analysis the member states and not the national governments. Hence, these classifications that do not take into account the fact that if the ideological scene of the party in government changes, it may be the case that in their member state there is a change of preference for anti or for rule of law enforcement. And on the other hand, these classifications succeed in identifying extreme cases, those that have been very vocally and loudly in favor or against the rule of law enforcement, but they fail to classify the broad spectrum of national governments and member states that fall into a middle ground and whose positions are not as clear as in other cases. So on the first place, we aim to contribute by creating a comprehensive classification in 4 categories of national governments between 2016 and 2021. I will later explain these 4 categories. And also, secondly, we aim to examine and determine which factors explain the formation of these voting preferences regarding the rule of law enforcement in the Council. So, well, I assume that we all know it, but the Article 7 problem goes beyond the unanimity requirement, because it is true that we cannot use the sanctions because there are 2 member states in the Council that are experiencing a democratic backsliding, hence they veto the decision and protect each other. But for using the recommendations, there's only a majority of 4/5 required, which means that 22 member states voting in favor is enough to address these recommendations. The literature has argued, we have anchored our theoretical explanation in the, first of all, taking into account the tactical argument, which would be the idea that the perception of existing blocking majority in this vote of Article 7 is the pressure on some governments to explicit their position. Then that's why we have a big spectrum of member states not being very clear in what they prefer regarding rule of law enforcement, and also the existence of a one-wagon effect, which would mean that some member states that are in this middle ground would probably vote against, because they would perceive that the against option is the winning one in the Council. But we want to go beyond this tactical calculus and look into the factors that have determined the preferences of each national government in this sense, and to determine whether this existing majority has been achievable. This majority of 22 member states has been achievable at any point of time. We have identified in the literature various factors determining voting preferences in the Council, and we have classified them into 3 big blocks. The first one includes structural conditions, which are those related with the member state, so they are unchangeable. The first one has to do with geography, which is basically the position of that member state in a map. And secondly, membership duration, which is basically the time of accession to the European Union. And in the literature, we have find some contradiction because, as we know, there is some of an overlap between the West East cleavage and the old new member state cleavage. And some authors have demonstrated that Eastern member states are more likely to register opposition in the Council, while in other works we have found that it's the older member states the more likely to dissent in the Council. So we would like to clarify this contradiction that we have found in some empirical works. And the second and the other condition we have is size, which is basically the size of the member state in terms of population. And we argue that this, the literature argues that this can determine its enforcement capacities and its opposition capacities. Therefore, bigger member states have more resources administratively and so on to pursue their position when they are against a voting decision in the Council. Then we have semi-structural conditions, which would be those ones that are subject to change, but more often remain stable. And we have identified the cleavage between net contributors and beneficiaries. And in the literature, we have only found that this relates probably with integrationist preferences. So we probably need to go deeper in the theory on this cleavage, but for the moment is what we have found. And last but not least, we have circumstantial conditions, which are those ones related with the national governments and that change with the change of the government. First of all, we have the ideological sympathy for the offender member state argument, which would say that similar ideological stance would make governments more willing to protect Hungary and Poland. And in this sense, we have preferred to take into account the ideological stance in terms of Galtan axis, left, right positions, because we wanted to go deep into the ideological argument and not the partisanship argument, sorry, that has more to do with the utilitarian calculus that I want to protect a party that is in my European Parliament family, but it's a rational utilitarian calculus, not an ideological sympathy. Then we have the democratic quality. And here the literature argues that autocracies tend to protect each other's. And finally, the European Union integration stance. And in this regard, the theory would say that opposition to enforcement in the Council would be a defense mechanism in order to prevent the European Union to get more power and to go further in the process of integration. In which regards to our research design, well, first of all, in order, we have identified 92 national governments in the 28 member states between 2016 and 2021. But finally, we have only found enough evidence to establish the position of 62 national governments. So that's the number of cases which we count. And we have obtained this evidence by looking at official documents, speeches, declarations, and actions related to the rule of law enforcement. For example, whether that government put questions or not during the Article 7 hearings, or whether they requested the presidency of the Council to conduct a hearing and this type of actions. We have defined 4 categories for which we have also created some indicators that could be consulted in the paper. And these categories are committed for rule of law enforcement governments, which are those ones that have been loudly and vocally in favor of rule of law enforcement and have lead this position. Then we have soft rule of law enforcement, which would be those governments that are in favor of tackling the situation in Poland and Hungary, but they do so in an acquiescence with the committed pro rule of law enforcement rather than in a position of leadership. Then we would have reluctant anti-rule of law enforcement governments, which are those that are against the rule of law enforcement, but they have not taken much confrontational attitude against the European Union. And finally, we would have a strong anti-rule of law enforcement governments, which are those ones completely against the European Union action regarding the democratic backsliding. They have adopted a confrontational attitude, and of course, they have some problems with the European Union institutions in terms that the Union has activated different enforcement mechanisms, and particularly the Article 7 against them. As for the conditions, this has been quite challenging. First of all, in terms of size, we have counted as big member states, those having more than 7 million inhabitants, which are Germany, France, Spain, Italy, Poland, and the UK, the big six of the European Union. And then we have had some problems to, first of all, deal with this overlapping between East, West, all new cleavage. And also because if we divided the union into four, the whole union into four geographical categories, we had too many conditions in order to conduct the QCA, which is the strategy we have used to analyze the data. And we have many conditions in relation with the number of cases, and also to SQ conditions, because there wasn't similar sets, the ones having the condition and the ones not having them. So we had choice by overlapping, as I said, the members' relation argument with the East-West, and then we have analyzed the division North-South for only the western part of the European Union. Then we have the contributor beneficiary cleavage, which we have measured it by using European Commission yearly data. Then the ideological stance has been measured by using the Galtan indicator of the Chapel Hill survey. The European Union integration stance has been measured by the EU position indicator of the Chapel Hill survey. And finally, for democratic quality, we have used VDEM annual reports. For the analysis, as I said, we have used, in order to determine the conditions explaining directional preferences. Directional preferences are those qualitatively different, to be a rule of law enforcer or an anti-rule of law enforcer. And we have used QCA with our software. And if any of you are familiar with this method, which I suppose that yes, we have put quite high consistency thresholds both for necessity and sufficiency. And then we wanted also to use QCA for determining differences in intensity of the preferences, in whether you are a committed or a soft pro or anti-enforcer. But we saw that we could have a lot of problems because the outcome set was very skewed. There was not 50% of cases falling into one side or the other. So this would have presented a lot of problems for us to differentiate between necessary and sufficient conditions. So for the moment, we have taken just a more descriptive and more observing approach just to establish these differences. In which regards to the findings related with directional preferences, we have conducted the QCA, and it appears that in order to be a pro-enforcer, to be an all member state is a necessary condition. And then for sufficient conditions, we had to deal with model ambiguity, because we have obtained two models that to be a government in an all member state with a lack of tan ideology is a sufficient configuration to be a pro-enforcer, while the second model says that high levels of democratic quality and a government which does not fall in the tan side of the ideological axis is also a sufficient configuration for the government to have a pro-rule of law enforcement preference. And we need to interpret this carefully, because we for the moment we haven't done it yet. And then for anti-rule of law enforcement governments, we have as a necessary condition not to be in the north of the European Union. We have taken as non-member states Germany, Finland, Belgium, Netherlands, Denmark, and France, and UK and Ireland, if I remember it well. And then we have several swing conditions that we also need to interpret carefully, but most of them have to do with the idea of being not to be an old member state. And we need to interpret whether this can be functional equivalence, the idea of not to be an old member state and not to have good levels of democracy, not to be an old member state and have governments that fall into the tan side of the ideological axis, or to be not to be an old member state and have governments with a more anti-European integration stance. But as I said, this is just the results of the QCA and we need to interpret them. And for sufficiency, we have the same problems that for the pro-rule of law enforcers, which is that we have to deal with model ambiguity and interpret whether the sufficient condition is to be not to be an old member state or not to have good levels of democracy. As for the intensity preferences in which regards to committed and soft pro-enforcers, we had 31 pro-enforcement governments, of which 22 were committed and 11 were soft. And we have identified a north-south cleavage. So pro-rule of law enforcement governments are mostly southern member states. And we have identified that in 5 of the cases, these governments are very close to the GAL end of the ideological axis, while we have also identified that 7 of these governments are among the lowest levels of democratic quality among all the pro-enforcers. So these may be explanatory factors. And then we have 2 interesting deviant cases. The first one is Austria, the second government of Sebastian Kurz, which, even though is a northern member state, falls into the soft pro-rule of law enforcement position, and we probably attribute this to the experience of Austria with rule of law enforcement due to the higher cases in the early 2000s, and also to the fact that the first Sebastian Kurz government was an anti-enforcer. So this probably have had some influence in how the second Sebastian Kurz government did with the issue. And then the other interesting case is Portugal, which, even though it's a southern member state, has shown a very committed position with the rule of law. And finally, for which regards to the directional preferences regarding reluctant and strong anti-enforcers, well, we have classified as strong anti-enforcers the cases of Hungary, of the Fidesz governments and the PiS governments. And of course, these governments punctuate very high in the tan side of the ideological axis. All of them have a punctuation above 9/10. Then they have strong anti-rule of law, anti-European Union integration stance, and of course, the lowest democratic quality in the whole union. And in this point, we need to think about our categorization of the anti-enforcers, because we don't know whether we need to expand our classification for strong anti-enforcers to include some governments that present some differences in degree with certain reluctant anti-enforcers. We don't know if we are going to amplify this category or we are going to create a third category among the anti-enforcers. I can explain this better later if you need clarification. And here I have included some preliminary discussion of the results, but as I say, we need to take this carefully because this is very, very preliminary actually. First of all, in with regards to directional preferences, we have identified that structural factors play a key role, and time of accession is a very explanatory factor, and we interpret that this may have to do with a greater socialization of older member states with the union fundamental values and adoption as own values, which may have been more problematic for the newer member states. But as I say, this is a very preliminary idea. And then we have identified that there's a lot of path dependency in the position, and although the political sign of the government changes, directional preferences to be pro or anti remain stable in most member states, being the only exceptions Austria and Italy. In which regards to the intensity of the preferences, it may be the case that ideological sympathy is not the only factor playing a role, but also it may be the case that extreme positions are more likely to register opposition in the council than those governments that are more in the center of the ideological axis. The lower levels of democracy argument is not very solid because actually the governments I've mentioned before that are that present lower levels of democratic quality among the pro-rule of law enforcers. We can find also Luxembourg and Germany, and these two governments are strong pro-rule of law enforcers, so this argument does not stand very much, does not hold very much. And finally, we have thought about another plausible explanation, which may be that the effects of the crisis have played a role. Actually, this north-south cleavage among the enforcers may be explained by the fact that these were the member states the most affected by the crisis, and also the ones that coincide with the ones that receive a bailout. And it may be that as they have directly experienced harder scrutiny of the part of the European Union, are more reluctant to agree with this stronger scrutiny. And this would also explain the fact that Ireland and Portugal and the second government of Portugal does not fall into the soft pro-enforcer category, because the recovery from the crisis in these two member states was quite different than in the other, than in Spain, Italy, Greece, and Cyprus. But as I say, this is a preliminary idea. And finally, as for the next steps, we need to test our dependent variable, our classification, and increase its reliability. And for this, we are planning to do a test with an expert. We are going to give that person all the evidence we have and make that person classify the government, so to see whether this coincides with our classification or not. We need to go deeper into the theoretical section, and particularly on how the theoretical section relates with the results of our QCA and our qualitative analysis. But that's it basically. So I hope you have enjoyed, and I'm very open to all your comments, criticisms, and any ideas. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Gisela, for the presentation. We were perfectly on time. Only 1 more minute, so that's fine. So we have now Pablo. Are you somewhere?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me and see me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you so much, Gisela, for this very interesting presentation and for this very interesting paper that I enjoyed a lot reading. I actually have a lot of comments. So if at some point I'm speaking for too long, please just let me know, interrupt me, and I will stop and wrap up very fast.
And I will let you know as well, because we have at the most 30 minutes for everything. Okay.
Okay. So in the interest of time, I will try to be brief. But so first of all, I wanted to say the things that I really liked about the paper, which I think is also very important, because I think the paper tackles a very important issue, which has a lot of policy implications, and especially the paper provides an input of evidence-based information into a debate that has been dominated mostly by theory and also by doctrinal analysis. So I think this is very good because, so in general, there has been a lot of justified anger in the debate, in the academic debate, on why the European Union is not enforcing the rule of law mechanism. But we don't know the reasons why this is happening. And I think the paper provides a very important information about this. Then I think the paper is also very interesting because of the comprehensive classification on that data set that you provide. I think this is a very welcome contribution to the academic community. Although the classification, I have some caveats about it that I will mention later. And I think it's also very interesting that you are testing different types of conditions and that you are seeing the interaction between explanatory conditions of different type. And I think QCA is very well suited to do this. So these are the main points in the paper. And also the presentation was very good because I'm used to doing presentations with QCA. I understand how difficult it is to present a QCA paper. And I think the presentation was very efficient in presenting the analysis. So congratulations on that also. Now, how to improve the paper? So I think the paper insists a lot on parsimony, which we all know that in the social sciences, this is what we want, right? We want to attain parsimony. We want to provide explanations that are as simple as possible without oversimplifying. The thing is that QCA tries to achieve some middle ground between parsimony and complexity, as you know, Gisela. So to be honest, I would not insist so much in that you are trying to provide a parsimonious solution. And I would perhaps be more explicit about this trade-off between parsimony and complexity, and the fact that QCA is allowing you to attain not only parsimony, but also to explain cases in their complexity. And I think this is very important, and especially I think a QCA reviewer for a journal would tell you, well, don't emphasize so much the parsimony, because with QCA we're doing something else in addition to attaining parsimony. The second thing is that your main finding so far is not configurational, and I was a bit surprised about this. And as you know, in QCA, we try to explain causation. Well, if we can talk about causation, which is another debate, right? But we try to explain our solutions in terms of configuration. So in terms of how explanatory conditions interact with one another in producing an outcome. However, in the summary, in the summary of the paper and in the introduction, you mentioned that your main finding is the relevance of the all new member state cleavage as the main explanatory condition for your outcome. Even though you provide for an analysis of sufficient conditions, which is configurational. So I would try to provide for configurational, so I would try to explain the findings in configurational terms. Also being practical, I think this is what is going to be expected when you submit the paper to a journal, and especially your findings are configurational because you do find that there are interactions between explanatory conditions that might be relevant. Another thing, you test conditions that are derived from the literature, as you say. I think, of course, this is a good practice, but the problem with putting in a QCA model explanatory conditions that have already been tested by the literature is that these explanatory conditions and the results are going to be confirmatory. So you're going to have findings that, of course, are consistent with the literature, but then you are not going to, the contribution to the literature is going to be lesser precisely because the findings are confirmatory. Right, so instead of trying to find some counterintuitive idea, instead of challenging the literature, if you test conditions that have been already tried, you will have confirmatory findings. And I say this because this is something that I've done in my own research, and you know, I can tell you because I've done it. I think it's a better idea to try to do it differently. Another thing, you have information for 62 out of 92 governments. I think this is really important in QCA because, as you know, in QCA, we try to work with, not when it is possible, we try to work not with a sample, but with the whole population of cases, because in QCA, the findings are based on modest generalization. So if you could try, I understand this might just not be possible, but if you could try to find the 92 cases, information for the 92 cases, you would be in a much more robust position. If not, this is okay, but then you will have to discuss very transparently both the issue of the generalizability of the findings, that is to say, whether you can generalize to the 30 missing cases, which is like 30%, 33% of the sample. And also you will have to discuss whether these 30 missing cases are producing a bias in the sample. And this is something that is okay, but it's really important in my view that you discuss it very transparently and that you provide for a lot of explanation of this. Also, more explanation would be very beneficial in terms of the thresholds for the calibration of the explanatory conditions. For instance, when you discuss the size of the member states, the fact that you do the calibration cutoff at 7 million, this is okay, but it's really important that you justify why this is the calibration cutoff, because as you know, in QCA, different calibration can lead to totally different results. Therefore, the justification of these decisions is really, really important. Another thing, and I'm almost there, I just have a few more suggestions. You're using the parsimonious solution. you know that in QCA, the standard solution is the intermediate solution. So if you're not going to use the intermediate, well, there is a discussion, and Ulrich Thiem argues, I think it's Ulrich Thiem that argues that we should be using more often the parsimonious solution, but it is the intermediate solution is the standard of good practice in QCA. So if you are not going to use the intermediate solution, you have to explain why, and you have to justify it very well. And also, the reason you provide for using the parsimonious solution is that with the intermediate solution, the solutions are very complex. And this happens very often also in QCA. But I think the solutions are very complex because you are using a lot of explanatory conditions, which is technically possible. But perhaps it would be a good idea to try to simplify the model a little bit in order to obtain solutions that are precisely more parsimonious, a bit less complex, and you'll be able to explain the results more easily, which is at the end of the day, why we don't introduce a lot of explanatory conditions in QCA models. On deviant cases, you mentioned that you have some cases that are deviant, which are borderline. I understand that with FATSI this is different, but this is like borderline contradictory cases. But also, we know that in QCA, contradictory cases are telling us something about the models and about how the models could be improved. So I would pay attention to these deviant cases and try to interpret why they are contradictory in a way and what happens with them. How am I doing with time? Sorry.
Well, you are doing, you could be 3 or 4 minutes the most.
Okay. So I'm going to finish very fast. I'm going to finish very soon. It's very important to report coverage and consistency levels of the solutions as a whole, which probably is in the annex that I couldn't read, but I didn't see it in the main paper. And I'm going to leave it here, but so you have something that is also very good in the paper is that you have a very fine-grained outcome with 4 categories. But then you have the problem that with these 4 categories, it's really difficult to carry out the QCA analysis. So why don't you just use like a dichotomous outcome condition with only like positive and negative cases instead of this outcome condition with 4 categories? Or if not, you can use a FATSI set as an outcome condition. And I know that there is a debate in QCA on whether outcome conditions can be or not FATSI sets, but this is something you might want to explore. Some final remarks. This is a really good paper. I understand that there is still some work to do. It's an earlier stage of development, as you said, but this is a very promising paper, and I think it's a very welcome addition to the literature. I think it's really good that you are trying to provide this empirical input into all the debates. I think it's really good if you, at the end of the findings, you engage again with the literature and you discuss with all this doctrinal literature and theoretical literature. You're going to make a very important contribution to the literature in general. And then that's it from me. So congratulations and thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Pablo, for your very complete review of the paper. So now we have the open floor for more comments. Oh, unless Gisela, what do you prefer, Gisela? You would like to say something or you prefer?
Sí, si puedo, preferiría decir algo súper rápido a lo que me ha dicho Pablo. Vale, sobre lo que has comentado de las 4 categorías, es que claro, eso es un problema. Entonces, por eso, lo que hemos visto y que también teóricamente es que lo que nos ha salido, hay 2 tipos de categorías, ¿no? Las que son de intensidad y las que son de dirección, en plan, si tú eres un pro o un anti. Entonces, las que son de dirección nos permiten hacer el QCA con el outcome, con ceros y unos, con crises, porque de la otra manera es que yo no veía cómo poder solucionarlo porque me obligaba a hacer un outcome que fuese fuzzy sets y lo veíamos demasiado complicado. Entonces, como que la solución que hemos encontrado es intensidad y después ver dirección y luego ver esa intensidad. Si hemos hecho la categorización en solo 2, que son los pro enforcers y los anti enforcers, perderíamos mucha complejidad en el análisis, porque no es lo mismo el enforcement que hace Dinamarca que el que hace España, ¿sabes? Y de hecho es que tenemos el problema de que ahora con los anti-enforcers nos estamos planteando un poco si crear una tercera categoría, porque hay estados miembros gobiernos nacionales que simplemente han estado bastante callados, haciéndolo de manera muy quieta, otros han sido un poco más vocales y luego tenemos Polonia y Hungría, que es que nos parece como mal meterlo con cualquier otro caso, ¿no? Entonces, eso lo estamos trabajando y sí que es verdad que si no nos queda una categorización demasiado sencilla. Y luego, sobre todo lo demás que me has dicho, sí que estoy de acuerdo en que estoy obsesionada con la simplicidad, ¿no? del modelo, y es verdad que quizá al intentarlo hacer tan sencillo, tan entendible, tan parsimonioso, pues me he perdido muchas cosas por el camino. Es que justamente la semana pasada en Roma me dijeron de otro paper que presenté, me dijeron, es que QCA es demasiado complicado, no me gusta mucho, igual replantéate no usarlo, y ya ahí mi obsesión por la simplicidad se magnificó. Pero bueno, tienes razón que seguramente tendríamos que trabajar un poco más en qué solución elegir, cómo reportarla y sobre todo eso, ¿no? Pues ver si el modelo se puede hacer un poco más sencillo quitando condiciones y a ver si eso nos da soluciones más complejas pero mejores. Y el tema de, ya por terminar, la condición tamaño es muy problemática, porque en la literatura hay referencias a que el tamaño influye, ¿no? Pues cuanto más grande seas, mejor puedes expresar tu oposición en el Consejo. Es que realmente tenemos 6 Estados miembros grandes, es que no hay más. O sea, meter los que son medianos no tenía mucho sentido con los grandes, y de hecho a la hora de hacer el QCA, esta condición, es que creo que no te envié el anexo, pero la tenemos que quitar porque presenta skewness absoluta, o sea, es que no llega ni al 20% de casos, obviamente, ¿sabes? Entonces eso es que no, tenemos que pensar cómo solucionarlo y qué hacer con esa variable, la verdad. Pero bueno, muchas gracias, porque la verdad que todos los comentarios han sido increíbles y muy, muy útiles, de verdad.
Gracias a ti, Gisela, muchas gracias.
Gracias, Gisela. ¿Más comentarios al paper? Bueno, yo voy a hacer 2 comentarios. Si no hay ningún comentario. A ver, si entiendo, bueno, haré 3 comentarios. Si entiendo bien, igual me equivoco, porque he de reconocer que no me he leído el paper en detalle, me lo he leído de un modo transversal, ¿vale? Tu variable dependiente es voting in the council, ¿vale? Y estás mirando estos países. Lo que me sorprende es en tu selección de variables explicativas, es que básicamente apenas te basas en la literatura. O sea, voting in the council, el consejo básicamente es un actor que tiene una cultura de consenso muy, muy interiorizada, ¿no? Eso significa que prácticamente, bueno, y hay muchos estudios que así lo demuestran, estudios empíricos me refiero, no case studies, con una N hasta de 33.000 casos, que si yo recuerdo mal, Madeleine Hosley en el 2013 creo que fue, estudió 33.000 decisiones del Consejo y llegó a decir que el 97-98% todos estaban de acuerdo. Posteriormente hubo otro paper con temas mucho más, vamos a decir, controvertidos, porque es verdad que en la Unión Europea se legisla mucho sobre temas técnicos, no políticos, y es normal que haya esos niveles de consenso. Pero claro, en temas muy controvertidos, muy políticos, el nivel de consenso es un poquito menor, pero prácticamente es masivo, ¿no? Eso significa que yo creo que deberías de plantearte esto, o sea, empezar un poco por aquí, ¿no? O sea, ¿cómo influye esta cultura del consenso a la hora de explicar esto? Esto es muy importante. Y a lo mejor, que decir, o sea, si no hay un acuerdo entre estos países un poco para posicionarse en el artículo 7, a lo mejor algo tiene que ver con eso, ¿no? No lo sé, es una pregunta abierta, simplemente la dejo ahí. Luego, desde el punto de vista de las variables explicativas, hay una que yo en un paper de 2014 con Thompson mostramos que es la variable que más y mejor explica el voto en el Consejo, que es básicamente, y tú no las mencionas aquí, ni la mencionas, que es la interacción, no es la cooperación política o la ideología o la calidad democrática, es la interacción económica. Y esto es parte de la teoría intergubernamentalista, ¿no? Es decir, o sea, está demostrado empíricamente que estos países que cooperan económicamente entre ellos nunca votan cuando uno vota, cuando para ellos un tema es muy importante, nunca se va a posicionar aunque esté en contra, nunca se va a posicionar en contra, ¿no? Dicho de otra manera, las redes económicas entre estados son más importantes que las políticas. Yo creo que eso lo encuentro un poco missing en las variables que tú has utilizado, ¿no? Y luego una pregunta. Entiendo lo de el tema del tamaño, un poco por lo de la complejidad y todo esto, pero creo que la lógica con la cual funciona no estoy seguro que sea exactamente la que mencionas, ¿no? Porque la lógica de por qué los estados grandes o el tamaño de los estados, que aparte dices, has dicho mayor de 7 millones de habitantes, pero es que mayor de 7 millones de habitantes hay muchos otros que no has mencionado. Por ejemplo, Holanda, que yo sepa, tiene 16, o Hungría tiene 12, perdón, Rumanía tiene también por ahí 15, 16. Lo que quiero decir con esto es, no digo que los introduzcas, ya sé que el modelo se complejiza, etcétera, etcétera. Pero lo que sí que digo es que tienes que ser un poco consistente cuando presentas un poco esto y también explicar cuál es la lógica del tamaño, porque aquí el tamaño importa, pero el tamaño importa porque, claro, países grandes, evidentemente, votan más en contra, si se quiere, no porque estén más en contra de la cultura del consenso o del disenso, mejor dicho, del disenso, ¿no? Sino porque realmente tienen y esto está también muy demostrado empíricamente en la literatura, tiene un abanico de intereses mucho más amplio y hay muchas veces, y prácticamente votan en todos los temas, cosa que los países pequeños tienen un abanico de intereses mucho más reducido y con le da igual, quiero decir, o sea, a países como Austria la pesca le da igual, a países como, bueno, la pesca hay 50.000 temas, ¿no? A países como Malta, la regulación, el 80% de las regulaciones que se adoptan les da exactamente igual, etcétera, etcétera, ¿no? Con lo cual, lo digo porque a la hora de razonar estos temas en el paper, claro, yo no sé, supongo que este paper lo querrás editar en o publicar en algún sitio, pero yo creo que hay que ser un poco fino cuando razonas estas cosas, ¿no? Porque a mí creo que es más importante el argumento que has dicho, el argumento empírico. Es decir, no quiero coger muchos países, pues porque el modelo es mucho, pero claro, luego tienes que ser consistente a la hora de explicar el por qué coges a los países que coges y te dejas fuera a los que te dejas, ¿no? Y explicar las cosas un poco más appealing, ¿no? Bueno, básicamente estos son mis comentarios añadidos a los de Paulo. No sé si alguien más quiere hacer algún comentario, porque nos quedan 10 minutos. No, Gisela, no sé si quieres... pero bueno, dicho esto, y aquí sí que me gustaría creo honestamente que este paper puede complementar muy bien, o sea, la concepción de este paper es fabulosa, en el sentido de que este es un tema muy, muy, muy candente ahora mismo. Y además, y aquí también me gustaría que tú esto lo dejaras patente en el paper, ¿no? Que realmente esto añade a la literatura el coger un tema que es altamente conflictivo y que desde esa perspectiva se diferencia del resto de la literatura. Porque evidentemente no es lo mismo votar sobre un tema en el que están todos de acuerdo, sobre un tema que realmente despierta grandes controversias, y en ese sentido la capacidad explicativa que tú tienes en tu paper es mucho mayor que lo que se ha hecho previamente yo diría, una mayoría de los papers que han estudiado este tema, ¿no? Por tanto, ahí yo creo que tienes capacidad de vender, bueno, no de vender, realmente de explicar que realmente es una investigación muy, muy interesante y muy importante para entender los mecanismos de voting in the council y qué mecanismos hay detrás, ¿no? Y la idea esa que tienes a mí, la idea de metodología que hay detrás, a mí me fascina, creo que es fascinante, o sea, porque que yo sepa nadie ha hecho esto, nadie ha tenido esta estructura básicamente metodológica a la hora de plantearse estas cosas, ¿no? Se ha intentado explicar, si quieres, el poco disenso de unos parámetros muy distintos, ¿no? Y eso yo creo que también creo que lo tienes que dejar patente, ¿no? La innovación en la metodología a la hora de afrontar un tema tan complejo como este. Eso es muy importante. Y en ese sentido sí que te doy la enhorabuena porque creo que claramente contribuye de un modo importante a lo que se ha hecho hasta ahora, ¿no? Y bueno, la verdad es que esto es todo lo que se me ocurre, después de oírte y de haber mirado el paper así de un modo transversal. No sé si Gisela quiere decir algo, o si alguien más quiere decir algo. Nos quedan todavía 7 minutos.
No, o sea, básicamente gracias porque son comentarios pues, brutales, muy, muy buenos, la verdad. Lo del tamaño es que sí, es problemático. O sea, eso vamos a tener que repensar qué hacemos con esa condición porque no está bien justificada ni bien definida, ni siquiera sabemos si la vamos a poder tener en cuenta, por lo que te digo, ¿no? Que luego es que en el análisis metodológico ni siquiera la podemos casi incluir. Entonces, bueno, y lo demás, pues estoy de acuerdo en que todo pues muy útil y muchas gracias, la verdad.
No, gracias a ti. Yo de mayor quiero poder hablar contigo cuando publiques este paper en el canal y creemos tendencia en la política europea a la hora de explicar el disenso, que es un tema muy complejo, ¿eh? Y además hace falta ser muy valiente para enfrentarse a estos temas, porque no es fácil enfrentarse a estos temas, es mucho más fácil enfrentarse a otros temas que no diré cuáles. ¿Vale? Bueno, vamos a dejarlo aquí. Vamos, si no hay nada más, vamos con Joan, que es la presentación siguiente. Joan, tienes de 20 a 30 minutos, ¿vale? Como mucho, para hacer tu presentación.
En principio, con 20 bastará. Me meto mi cronómetro. Vale, pues I'm going to present this paper, which we have written with Marcello Natali, who is also based here in Milan, and Walter Shekel from the London School of Economics. The paper is titled "Money Makes the World Go Round. How much difference do recovery and resilience plans make to fiscal and social governance?" So, as the title indicates, the paper is about the recovery and resilience facility, about how it works and so on. The point of departure of the paper is the uncontroversial observation that with the adoption of the NGO package, and particularly with the adoption of the recovery and resilience facility, the EU moves temporarily, but moves away from mainly regulating national budgetary policies towards supporting member states' fiscal policies. That is, although temporarily, the EU governance acquires more treasury-like functions in a way. So, given this change, our research question, which not is very original, is what does this temporary availability of a large pool of fiscal resources do to EU socioeconomic governance, and why we are interested in on the effects of this of the RRF, of this large pool of fiscal resources. We're interested on the effects of the RRF, both with regards both in terms of authority and in terms of policy. That is why we are interested in the changes that the RRF introduces in European governance, both in terms of the relationship between the actors, how the relationship between EU actors change, as well as how the policies adopted through EU governance mechanisms change. To study this, we study the implementation of the RRF in two countries, in Italy and Spain. That is, we study the drafting and implementation of an initial implementation of the national recovery plans of Italy and Spain. The case selection basically is justified because these are two countries. On the one hand, as it has been said before by Andrea, Italy and Spain are the two main recipients of RRF funding, but also because Italy and Spain constitute, we could say, challenging cases for the successful implementation of the RRF, to the extent that these two countries have a weak or poor record in absorbing cohesion funds, in adopting EU policy prescriptions, and less, but also in adopting country-specific recommendations in the context of the semester. And in terms of methods, the analysis draws on elite interviews, in-depth elite interviews, and document analysis. So, how do we study these changes of the RRF on EU economic governance? we develop an analytical framework by drawing on 3 different strands of literature on EU governance. We could say three different analytical perspectives on EU governance, which it makes sense to, we argue it makes sense to draw on these 3 different strands because they provide quite different, maybe opposed expectations about how EU governance works or should work. And therefore, these 3 different strands of literature provide different expectations, testable empirical expectations about how the RRF should work. Which are these three analytical perspectives that we mobilize in the analysis? The first one is this, what we call the literature on fiscal surveillance. With this Javad and Pagan on 1988 as a foundational text, and basically this literature, this vision on EU governance. The basic point of this literature is the understanding of EU, understanding that the main challenge of EU governance, that the main problem of EU governance is avoiding the emergence of moral hazard in member states. That is, in a context of monetary integrations, there are incentives for the member states to adopt or to delay the adoption of unpopular reforms, to adopt unsustainable policies, because in this context of monetary integration, they know that they will be able to offload some of the cost of these unsustainable policies onto other member states. So if you see if you think that this is the main challenge, the main risk of EU governance, then you think that the main function of EU governance is to constrain member states' fiscal policy decisions. That is, the main function of EU governance is to provide the top-down enforcement mechanisms that constrain in a certain way the room of discretion of member states. In a sense, the function of EU governance is to provide the discipline that member states lack. And if we have to think in historical examples that epitomize this vision of EU governance, probably the memorandums of understanding adopted the macroeconomic programs adopted during the euro crisis under the ECM and so on, they embodied to a large extent this vision of EU governance. But opposed to this first strand of literature, there is another strand of literature which has, we could say, opposed expectations about how EU governance works, which is the experimentalist governance literature, mainly developed by Jonathan Seidlin with collaborators. For the experimentalist governance perspective, the main challenge of EU governance is not to avoid the emergence of moral hazard in member states, but is to provide forms of governance that improve the hierarchy, that improve the weaknesses that are inherent in hierarchical forms of government. That is, experimentalist governance scholars understand that in the EU polity hierarchy, top-down enforcement of decisions doesn't produce good innovative policies and so on. So they argue that different what they call experimentalist architectures of governance need to be implemented. And these experimentalist architectures basically consist in spaces of multilateral deliberation, of exchange of best practices, of exchange of information, and so on. Experimentalist governance, as I was saying, it provides these clear expectations about clear empirical observations about how governance structures works. They are divided in very briefly in 4 steps. There is this idea that first, the EU level of governance sets some broad framework goals that then the member states have discretion to implement these goals at the national level, but that in exchange for this discretion, in exchange for this autonomy, they have to participate in spaces of multilateral debate, multilateral surveillance, and in these spaces, member states, in reaction to exchanges, the process of policy learning will be developed, and member states will adopt corrective mechanisms in reaction to these policy learning processes, and also in reaction to implementation problems. And here enters this the experimentalist adjective, therefore. So basically, having these first two analytical perspectives, the questions that they pose on the RRF would be: does the RRF allows for the implementation of top-down structural reforms by, in a certain way, driving national administrations into reforms, using this new pool of fiscal resources to buy national administrations to do some reforms? This would be the research question following the fiscal surveillance paradigm. And in contrast, experimentalist governance would tend to think that the question would be: does the RRF, given this new fiscal space that allows, adopts it, does it allow for more deliberative multilateral spaces of policy making, and so on? In our paper, we develop a third perspective, not surprisingly. And we develop this perspective by drawing on what we call the Rockian perspective on European integration. That is the strand of the literature on EU integration that mobilizes the work of Stein-Rockan in order to study this. If Stein-Rockan had studied the historical process of state formation in Western Europe, in the last 20 years or so, different scholars have tried to use this what is called the state building literature of Rockan to study the polity formation process of the EU. So we mobilize this literature to understand RRF and EU governance. This Rockanian perspective has two basic points. Well, it starts from the Rockanian perspective. It starts from the definition of the EU as a compound polity, and being a compound polity, it means basically two things. On the one hand, it means that it's a polity that has a diverse membership, and not only a diverse membership, but these members are democracies. So it's a polity that is a union of democracy, democracy, as some of in the literature call it. Then, in governance terms, the implication of this diverse membership is that different levels of governance have different degrees of authority, but more importantly, loyalty is needed to ensure the work, the collaboration, and the functioning of the system. Loyalty between the different levels of government is needed to ensure the function of this diverse membership. For instance, in the case of the RRF, this implies that those member states more skeptical towards joint fiscal capacities requested, in order to adopt them, strong monitoring mechanisms on the member states that were going to receive the fiscal resources, fiscal resources from the center. And this, as we know, in the case of the RRF, this was translated in these strong monitoring mechanisms for the Commission. At the same time, there is a second important feature of a compound polity, or at least of the EU as a compound polity, which is this, what we call the weakness of the executive center in political terms. And by this, we mean that the Commission, which is the executive center, it has a very weak legitimacy basis, and more importantly, it has enforcement mechanisms on member states, but these enforcement mechanisms usually need to rely on the cooperation of member states. So again, it's an executive center that is weak because it depends again on the loyalty of member states to function. So from here, we draw this hypothesis on EU polity formation, which is in the EU, in order to build new authority mechanisms, you also need to build new mechanisms of loyalty. Okay, so these are the three different analytical perspectives that we mobilize in order to study the RRF. And I was saying we understand that each of these three analytical perspectives provides different empirical expectations about how the RRF works. In the paper, we organize these different expectations about how the RRF works in 7 different dimensions. 4 of these dimensions concern the governance dimension of the RRF, and 3 of these dimensions concern the policy substance of the RRF. With regards governance, we study in the paper. To be clear, we apply these 7 dimensions to study the process of drafting and implementation of the Italian and Spanish national recovery plans. And so we study of each of these plans, the agenda setting process, the monitoring process, the monitoring of the implementation, when conflicts emerge either in the agenda setting process or in the implementation process, how were these conflicts resolved? This is the 3rd dimension. We also study the inclusiveness of the process, that is the extent to which the RRF and the draft and the national recovery plans included actors beyond national executives. And then with regards policy, we study how problems were defined. We study the flexibility, the adaptability of these problems to the national context. And we study also the content of the policies, more in the sense of liberal versus social democratic orientation, or more the policy content in the policy content of the policy orientation of the policies adopted. I cannot go now into, for matters of time, into explaining the different expectations of the 3 analytical perspectives for each of these dimensions. I go directly to the results. Basically, after presenting this in the paper, there are two sections, each section presenting each case study. One section presenting how the Spanish National Recovery Plan was drafted and implemented, and then a case doing the same for Italy. Here, what I will present now in this penultimate slide is some of the preliminary findings for the moment, because the paper is a draft paper for the moment. Some of the preliminary findings that we have drawn from these case studies. We basically have observed that, as in the reform surveillance paradigm or vision, the Commission's monitoring role is quite forceful, and is quite more forceful, and is quite more forceful than it was in the European semester. Particularly the monitoring of the implementation of the plans is very detailed, containing both qualitative and quantitative indicators. We have also observed that, at least in Italy and Spain, at the domestic level, there has been a clear tendency towards executive dominance. That is, both in the drafting and in the implementation of the plans, the parliaments, the regional institutions, and also in Italy, but less in Spain, the social partners have been completely marginalized. And this also goes in line with expectations of the reform surveillance paradigm. And then we have also observed that when conflicts arose in the drawing up of the plans, it was more used the hierarchy of the Commission rather than the hierarchy of the Council in order to achieve compromise. However, in contrast to the reform surveillance paradigm, we have observed that the agenda setting process is quite less top-down, is quite less hierarchical. One moment, I have it here. It's not here. Is quite less hierarchical, the agenda setting process. So in both cases, in both Italy and Spain, although the recovery plans were drafted in taking into consideration the country-specific recommendations of 2019 and 2020, we have observed that both the Italian and Spanish national governments made active efforts to preempt the Commission taking control of the agenda setting process. On the conflict resolution, we have also observed that there is a difference. There has been a difference. While in the drafting phase of the plans, this conflict resolution has been quite deliberative, in the implementation phase is becoming quite more hierarchical. This we think that this makes sense to the extent that during 2021, during the drafting phase of the plans, there was a need to get the plans approved in order to get the money flowing, in order to push up the recovery, and this was an interest shared by the Commission also. But once the plans have started to run, the Commission, it is becoming more hierarchical, and it wants to make sure that the plans are implemented as agreed in the operational agreements. Finally, with regards to the policy content of the plans, the problem definition in both countries has followed what we call an expansionary logic. And we mean by this that the plans tend to include long-awaited reforms and investment which probably without the RRF funding would have not been possible to adopt in these two countries. However, there is one important caveat in this, which is what in the paper we call the golden rule, which is that the RRF regulation stipulates that the reforms and investments cannot include new structural spending beyond 2026, beyond the existence of the RRF. And this, more in Italy than Spain, this has constrained some of the proposals that the Italian government made. Then, with regards to country specificity, we have, it was in the paper here. With regards to the country specificity of the plans, we have observed that in general, both the reforms, but especially the investments, they are quite uncontroversial, especially in Italy. Green and digital transition, social investment, and so on. Particularly in the social policy field, which is I forget to say this, is the field in which we study more. In Italy, there is a more controversial debate on the administrative and tax reforms, but in general, particularly the investments are quite incontroversial. And this, but also the reforms to a large extent. And this, we put it in a context of this ideational convergence between member states, particularly center-left governments, and the Commission in the last years that has been taking place in the last years. And finally, related to this, with regards to the policy orientation of the reforms, both in Italy and Spain, there is a clear predominance of what in the last years has been defined as the social investment paradigm. That is this kind of social policy which seeks to increase, in a way, human capital rather than traditional passive social policy. Okay, I'm done. The last slide is the conclusion. So coming back to the original research question, if we have to summarize the effects of the RRF on EU governance, we would say that the RRF has this, what we call a paradoxical dual effect. So it has two effects, which is a bit paradoxical that they occur at the same time. On the one hand, the RRF increases the leverage of the EU level to the extent that it provides funding. It provides this funding under the control of the EU level. Not surprisingly, it increases the leverage of the EU level, and also it increases it provides a stronger monitoring mechanisms for the EU level of governance. But also at the same time, we have observed what we call here, what we call in this slide, more national ownership. And this is recognized by the officials that we have interviewed, but also in the public communication of the national executives, and also in the different mechanisms to ensure the consensus, to ensure compromises and consensus between the executives and the Commission. So, two last points. We could say, in a sense, that money, this large pool of fiscal resources that I was speaking about at the beginning, it is in a sense a mixed blessing for member states, in the sense that, of course, this money provides room for doing long-awaited reforms, but it also implies more rigid or more strict and more top-down mechanisms of governance, particularly of monitoring. And then we finished the paper with this dab of this paradoxical dual effect that, in a way, it could be read as a win-win dynamic, in the sense that both the Commission and the national executives, paradoxically, both seem to increase their rooms of discretion. But while this was sustainable in the drafting phase of the plans, will this dynamic be sustained in the implementation phase, and will we see in the implementation phase this lack of open conflicts that we have seen until now? That's all on my part. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan, for the presentation. Well, I'm the reviewer, so I will try to be precise, although I believe that it's not easy, because I see many different and interesting points in this paper. Okay, sometimes when you were presenting the paper, when I was reading the paper, I had the perception that because maybe this is a professional deformation, because I've been working lastly in this book about Europeanization, but many things that you are saying in the paper are already in that book. Okay, I mean, because we identify a number of mechanisms basically that explain Europeanization. And it's very interesting, for example, the case you use of Italy, we in these policy areas in which clearly member states are willing to make reforms. I mean, this top-down process works pretty well. I mean, because you get money from the EU, and yet you have basically the resources to do whatever you want to do. But in these cases in which you receive money, but you are not so happy about what you are supposed to do according to the EU, then problems starts. Okay, so basically this means that domestic factors matter, and they are extremely relevant for explaining these processes. Okay, and at the end of the day, the construction of the EU polity is not only about these movements in the design of EU institutions, but also, of course, we need to pay attention quite a lot, I think, in domestic factors. Actually, I would argue that you have to pay more attention to domestic factors, and how these factors, more than to European factors, and how these factors actually change according to the EU governance. Okay, so I think the focus of the research should be much more placed on that, more than whether the European Commission has more enforcement position than in the European semester. Of course, that has more enforcement position than European semester. The European semester has been a complete disaster. Okay, I mean, the European, in the case of Spain, for example, from 2013 to 2022, the European Commission is repeating a number of measures, social and political and economical measures, and no year has been actually attended by Spanish governments. Okay, so this means basically how useless is this European semester. But the issue here is not only about the European semester; it's also about the new scenario with this funding. The question is whether this conditionality after the funding is finished is going to continue, and probably not. I mean, because clearly, it's, as I already argued before. I think domestic factors are important, and this is actually what I miss in your paper, because where domestic factors are more beyond the narrative you made about basically the Italian and the Spanish case. Okay, of course, there are two different cases, but I think probably I know that you basically to try to understand more the policy formation at the EU level, but we shouldn't forget these domestic factors and these variation of factors across member states, because they are extremely relevant. Okay. Also, when you say, for example, about the basically your hypothesis is you claim that loyalty mechanism is a very important one. Of course, it is a very important one to basically to consolidate the policy change in the European polity. But how can you get this loyalty? I think how can you get this loyalty from member states? That's the issue. It's not that you need that loyalty. Of course, we need the loyalty, but the question is, and this is not in the paper, to what extent these policies actually foster loyalty, or to what extent are there some kind of enforcement mechanisms basically to foster this kind of loyalty? Okay. Otherwise, probably no policy change is going to take place at the EU polity. Okay. But beyond all these things, I miss a little bit of direction, because there are many, like as we previously said, there are many different papers on this, and we are looking at different things, okay? And everything is a little bit combined. I don't see a clear direction, to be honest. When I was reading the paper, I have the perception sometimes I was reading two or three different papers, okay? And at the end of the day, it's because you have a research question, but then you go somewhere else, and then you come back, and then so I miss also a kind of a theory, a theory that actually tried to answer this question, okay? Because everything is very tentative, and I couldn't identify any real theory, even in your hypothesis. I don't see loyalty, okay, but your hypothesis, where is coming from this from which theory is coming from this hypothesis, okay? Or in other words, how is this paper contributing to the theory about, for example, the polity completion, or the compound polity, which is actually becoming the EU, okay? So, for example, some important questions you could make yourself is how, or to what extent, this is going to foster federal cooperation across between the vertical and the horizontal division of power in the EU. Basically, compound polity means that there is a vertical and horizontal division of power. Okay, so how the issue of federal systems is how they could cooperate with each other. This, okay, well, it's what you call loyalty, I guess, but I would just claim for cooperative structure federalism. Okay, so so the question is basically how or to what extent this kind of ad hoc policies as a consequence of a crisis actually could foster this kind of cooperative mechanisms within a new framework. Okay, and to be honest, and according to the literature, I think the scope is rather limited. Okay, because as we already said before, domestic factors are extremely relevant, and I'm afraid that this cannot be changed from a top-down perspective from the European Union. Okay, this is like the external incentive model we were talking before. This is part of the game, but this is probably a smaller part if we compare to other factors. Okay, so well, I was missing some kind of discussion also on your paper about all these mechanisms which are already in the literature, and if they are not, don't worry, our book is coming soon and everything is explained there, okay? No, seriously, because I mean, I was very intellectual, particularly when I was writing the conclusions, just after reading the whole book. You realize that there are 8 mechanisms or 9 in our book. We found basically 9 mechanisms of, and it's very interesting to think a little bit how it's related one to each other, okay? And how, for example, how limited is the European Union to Europeanize? Because at the end of the day, I mean, the more sensitive political and social issues, and you are looking also at social policies, depend on the member states, and the room of action of the European Union as a system of governance is rather limited. Okay, so well, I don't know if this is helpful, but I mean, because I couldn't find a real structure in your paper, so I've been talking a little bit about everything I could find in your paper, but I think you have like very nice. I think there could be like 2 or 3 nice papers from here. Okay. And I would, if I were you, basically, I would just theorize about cooperative federalism, to what extent this could be increased, the structure of cooperative federalism in Europe as a consequence of the crisis, okay, of the crisis and the new opportunity structure that are basically, for example, with these enforcement mechanisms, although it is not clear that this has a long standing persistence in the member states. Okay, so at the end of the day, what economists say, I think they are right, that until you don't get like a common fiscal policy, no federal state is possible. That's clear. Okay, because economics, the unity of economics will bring the unity of politics. After beyond that, I mean, is, well, I think this is a divertimento. Okay, but I would have been more compelling in calling, for example, this cooperative federal structure. Or, yeah, I mean, is latent in your well, in your hypothesis and in your research question, but I don't think it's clear enough. Okay, and you could use perfectly these 2 case studies to see to what extent this has actually changed the EU governance in these 2 particular cases. Okay, and in what direction. I think that would be the most interesting contributions of this paper. Okay, so I think I'm going to leave it here. I don't know if there are more comments, or Joan, I don't know if you want to say something.
Yes. Yes. No, clearly it's true that the paper lacks this certain sense of pursuing in a more consistent manner a direction. We finished it for the SGO conference like in a little bit of hurry, and in the last after the conference we couldn't work on it. But yeah, I mean it should be the next step to try to streamline it and give it more consistency. And then on the more, I agree on this to refocus a little bit more on what has happened at the national level, and including some of the factors that literature, for instance, the literature on Europeanization and so on, considers important for policy change to take place. And we have a lot of, given the interviews that we have done, we have a lot of information about how has this gone at the national level. The moment in this version of the paper, we opted for focusing this more on, as you were saying, on the EU level perspective. But well, we have to consider this option of moving a little bit the focus of analysis towards the national level. And then I also, I mean, we preparing the paper, we read on this on the literature on federalism, on also this laboratory federalism literature, cooperative federalism. At the end, we opted for these other perspectives, mainly because of this, because we thought that they were useful in providing very opposed expectations about how EU governance works, and therefore they were illuminating some they were illuminating very different rationalities of EU governance. That's why we choose the analytical perspectives that we choose. But yeah, I mean, I agree that it could be interesting to investigate this, to utilize this literature also.
Excellent. Yeah, you have a work to do, from now on. Okay. Well, I don't know. This is an open floor now to anyone who wants to say something. I mean, something interesting and intelligent. Okay. Bueno, whatever. Okay, well, so many thanks for everyone. It was a pleasure, honestly, to have again this session. I mean, I really love to discuss papers and to read papers, and I think it's just great. I mean, once per year, okay? I mean, and to be able to have, no, seriously, I really like it. I mean, and it's, would be great to be able to see us personally next year, well, probably before we will see individually, but it would be great if we could next year do something presential in any place. We're looking at exotic places, but probably it's more difficult for people to go there. So maybe we have to be more pragmatic and do it either in Barcelona, Madrid, or I don't know, Mallorca. Mallorca would be also possible. Although we could find, if we really, we could also find some funding, at least for paying the I don't know, some basics, okay, the travel expenditures, and maybe one night or something like that. I mean, these kind of things we could afford it, I think. But yeah, I mean, in the meantime, we are already thinking our next project. We are going to work on a new book. If anyone is interested, yes. We are going to talk about the impact of the EU policies on EU citizenship from a very broad perspective, okay? And we have already some very good ideas, and just let me tell you one, which is already undergoing this paper, which is basically the impact of monetary and macro monetary policies on inequalities between generations, intergenerational inequalities as a consequence of macroeconomic policies in some member states. Okay, this is just one example. Of course, I mean there will be different papers. Okay, but the main line of that book would be related to basically to the idea of citizenship from a broad perspective, rights, and other kind of issues. Also could be also related to public opinion, of course, because I mean this is an important issue, the perceptions of citizens about how things are going in these kind of policies. Okay, but also there will be, of course, papers related to policymaking and how policymaking is actually creating this idea of European citizenship. Okay, so. Anyway, any ideas, because we are always moving, now we are moving into that direction, but we could move to other exciting directions. There are so many exciting directions to move, So any ideas would be welcome. And of course, to all of you, well, some of you are already in Barcelona, but to the rest, you are always welcome to Barcelona, okay? Yes, if you are here or you want to come to Barcelona, I will be delighted to invite you for lunch and to discuss about whatever you are doing and so on and so forth. Okay.
The same in Milan. You are all welcome if you pass by here.
We are invited to Milan. Wow, this is like a nice offer. We will consider this possibility.
Always ready to grab a beer.
Okay. Well, when I said I will invite you to a lunch, I was meaning a nice lunch. This means not a lunch in the university, okay? So outside the university. Okay. Anything else from anyone? So you are not from Barcelona, because we didn't meet personally. So if you are coming to Barcelona anytime, just let me know. We can just have a meeting, okay?
Okay, perfect.
Well, and the same for Gisela, although Gisela is not from Barcelona, but I mean, and Paulo is not from Barcelona either, but sometimes they come. So if you come, you are also very welcome. And for the rest of the people, they are, well, I think we meet more regularly, okay? So, but of course, Alexandra and Juan, you are always welcome to Barcelona, not only to the Primavera Sound, but also for other things, okay?
Okay, thank you, perfect.
Sounds good. Thank you very much, Javier.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you very much and bye-bye.
And
Have a nice summer.
Joel, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks a
Bye-bye.
lot for organizing to also join.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Bye.
that was great.
Bye.
Have a good one.
Thanks. Bye.